The war was not supposed to reach here. In early 1945, the Japanese home islands were surrounded, bombed, and blockaded, but still untouched by something the Imperial Navy believed impossible: direct American attack from the sea at point-blank range by a submarine. Submarines were hunters, not raiders. They stalked shipping lanes. They fired torpedoes. They vanished. They did not surface within sight of the Japanese coastline, assemble weapons on deck, and open fire like a destroyer. Yet on the night of January 23, 1945, one American submarine did exactly that. USS Barb slid silently through the darkness off the coast of Karafuto, Japan. Her captain, Commander Eugene Fluckey, stood on the bridge staring at the shoreline. Factories visible, rail lines exposed, lights glowing faintly against the snow. This was enemy territory, so close that Japanese sentries could hear waves hitting the hull. Every rule said turn away. Submarine doctrine warned against surfacing near land. Shore batteries, patrol boats, aircraft. One mistake meant annihilation. Even aggressive skippers stayed offshore. This close, a submarine wasn't a predator anymore. It was a target. Fluckey ignored the rulebook. Instead of diving, he ordered Barb to surface. Instead of torpedoes, his crew rolled experimental rockets onto the deck. Weapons never intended for submarine use, barely tested, wildly inaccurate by design standards. The plan was simple, reckless, and unprecedented. Bomb Japan from the surface and disappear before anyone could react. What followed lasted only minutes, but it shattered a psychological barrier the Japanese believed unbreakable. For the first time in the war, Japan was about to learn that nowhere, not even its own coastline, was beyond reach. And this was only the beginning. Before USS Barb left these waters, her crew would do something no American unit had ever done and would never do again. If you want more real World War II stories where a single decision rewrote the rules of war, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment below with the WWII event you think shouldn't have worked, but did. Eugene Bennett Fluckey did not look like a reckless man. He spoke softly. He listened more than he talked. And he had an unsettling habit of smiling at moments when other officers went silent. But inside the U.S. submarine force, Fluckey already had a reputation by 1945. Not for disobedience, but for refusing to fight predictable wars. Submarine doctrine in the Pacific was conservative for a reason. One mistake underwater meant no second chance. Commanders were trained to avoid shallow water, avoid coastlines, avoid any situation where escape routes were limited. Fluckey saw those rules differently. To him, predictability was the real danger. Japanese escorts had learned how American submarines hunted. Shipping lanes were guarded. Convoys zigzagged. Air patrols covered open water. The enemy expected submarines to behave like submarines. So Fluckey decided USS Barb would behave like something else entirely. By early 1945, Barb had already sunk more Japanese tonnage than most boats would see in an entire war. Fluckey had earned the trust of his crew, not by promising safety, but by proving that his risks had purpose. He studied intelligence reports obsessively. Shore defenses, rail schedules, weather patterns, tide tables. Anything static attracted his attention. That's when he noticed something everyone else ignored. Japan's coastal infrastructure was exposed. Factories sat within visual range of the sea. Rail lines ran along beaches. Patrol patterns were thin, built on the assumption that submarines would never dare approach so close. Fluckey didn't see defenses. He saw assumptions. If a submarine could approach silently, if it could surface briefly, if it could strike and vanish, then Japan's psychological shield, the belief that its homeland was untouchable, could be cracked without an invasion. USS Barb wasn't ordered to do this. No manual suggested it. No superior approved it. No precedente existit, which made it perfect. Fluckey didn't plan to fight Japan's navy. He planned to fight Japan's confidence. And the next decision he made would push his crew into territory where no American submarine had ever operated, not just geographically, but mentally. The weapons on USS Barb's deck were not supposed to be there. Submarines were not designed to carry rocket launchers. There was no doctrine, no field manual, no training course for what Fluckey had in mind. The rockets were experimental, adapted from Army systems, crude by naval standards, and dismissed by many officers as inaccurate novelties. Accuracy wasn't the point. Fluckey understood something most planners missed. He wasn't trying to destroy factories. He was trying to prove access. On the night Barb surfaced, the sea was calm and the air bitterly cold. Snow dusted the shoreline. The Japanese coast lay just beyond small arms range, close enough that any delay could be fatal. The crew worked fast. Rocket racks were assembled on deck in near darkness. There was no margin for error. A misfire could ignite fuel. A jam could trap the submarine on the surface. Enemy patrols could appear at any second. When Fluckey gave the order, the rockets streaked toward shore. Shrieking, erratic, uncontrolled. Some missed. Some struck empty ground. Others hit industrial buildings and rail yards, exploding in flashes of orange against the snow. The bombardment lasted minutes. Then Barb was gone. By the time Japanese coastal defenses reacted, the sea was empty. The damage itself was limited. No factories were leveled. No rail line permanently destroyed. By conventional metrics, the attack barely registered. But something far more valuable had been achieved. Japan had just been attacked. Not by aircraft, not by surface ships, but by a submarine firing rockets from within sight of the coast. That single fact traveled faster than any damage report. Submarine commanders across the Pacific read Fluckey's after-action report with disbelief. Many thought it reckless. Some called it unnecessary. Japanese commanders reacted differently. Coastal defenses were reinforced. Patrol patterns shifted. Resources were diverted inward, away from shipping lanes where submarines actually inflicted the most damage. Fluckey had forced the enemy to defend everywhere. And as USS Barb slipped back into deep water, her crew believed the patrol was already extraordinary. They were wrong. Fluckey wasn't finished. He was about to authorize an operation so small it sounded absurd, and so audacious it would become one of the strangest missions in World War II. The idea did not come from Washington. It didn't come from fleet headquarters. It didn't come from a planning board or an intelligence office. It came from the deck of a submarine, floating off the coast of Japan, while its captain stared at a railway line cutting through the snow. Railroads were Japan's arteries. With fuel scarce and roads inadequate, trains carried coal, food, troops, and raw materials along predictable schedules. Submarines had sunk ships. Aircraft had bombed cities. But the rail network, especially in the north, still functioned. Fluckey saw an opportunity no one had written down. If rockets could reach the shore, then men could reach it too. The plan was almost absurd in its simplicity. A small team would go ashore at night, plant explosives beneath the tracks, return before dawn. No firefot, no sabotage spree, just one detonation, timed to a passing train. The risk was enormous. Capture meant execution. There would be no rescue, no reinforcement. If the submarine was forced to dive, the men ashore would be abandoned without hesitation. Fluckey asked for volunteers. 8 men stepped forward. They were not commandos, not special forces. They were submariners, machinists, electricians, gunners, trained to fight underwater, not sneak through enemy territory. None had ever set foot on Japan. In the freezing darkness, they paddled ashore in a rubber boat, dragging equipment that barely functioned in the cold. They worked by touch, counting seconds, listening for footsteps, their breath fogging the air. They planted a pressure-triggered explosive beneath the rail. Then they waited. At 1:47 a.m., the train came. The explosion lifted the locomotive off the tracks. Cars piled into each other. The sound echoed through the forest, then vanished. Within minutes, the men were back at the shore. USS Barb surfaced long enough to retrieve them, then disappeared into the Pacific. No American force would ever conduct another ground operation on the Japanese home islands during the war. 8 men had done alone. The damage could be repaired. The message could not. Japan was no longer unreachable. Not from the air, not from the sea, and now, not even from the ground. Sabotage is only half a mission. Survival is the other half, and often the harder one. By the time USS Barb slipped back into deep water, Japanese forces were already reacting. Patrol boats swept the coastline. Searchlights scanned the sea. Aircraft circled where the explosion had occurred, hunting for a target that no longer existed. Fluckey knew the danger wasn't over. Submarines leaving coastal waters were at their most vulnerable. Shallow depths restricted maneuvering. Sonar contact multiplied. Any mechanical failure could mean being trapped within reach of depth charges and shore batteries. For nearly 2 days, Barb was hunted. Depth charges detonated close enough to shake the hull. Instruments failed. Crewmen were thrown from their bunks. Each explosion carried the same question. Was this the one that found them? Fluckey refused to rush. He ordered silent running. Engines at minimum speed. No unnecessary movement. No unnecessary sound. Men whispered. Tools were wrapped in cloth. Even breathing felt loud. It worked. Japanese forces expected a fleeing submarine to sprint for open water. Barb did the opposite. Creeping along the seabed, changing course unpredictably, waiting for the enemy to lose patience. Eventually, they did. When the pressure lifted, Fluckey allowed himself one small indulgence. He smiled. The patrol wasn't just successful. It was transformative. USS Barb had bombarded Japan from the surface, landed Americans on Japanese soil, destroyed infrastructure with minimal resources, escaped without losing a single man, all without permission. The implications were uncomfortable. If one submarine could do this, why hadn't others? The answers weren't flattering. Fear of deviation, fear of failure, fear of responsibility. Fluckey had accepted all three and survived. His after-action report circulated quietly. Some officers dismissed it as luck. Others read it again and again. But the enemy had read it too, in the language of reaction. More patrols, more defenses, more resources pulled away from the front lines. USS Barb hadn't just damaged targets. It had reshaped Japanese priorities. And when the submarine finally returned to base, its crew expected reprimands. They received something else entirely. When USS Barb returned to port, no one was quite sure what to do with her. The patrol report didn't fit neatly into any category. It wasn't a standard submarine engagement. It wasn't a surface action. It wasn't an airstrike. It included rockets fired from a surface submarine, a ground raid conducted by enlisted sailors, and a successful withdrawal from enemy coastal waters. There was no form for that. Some officers read the report and focused on what could have gone wrong. The lack of authorization. The risks taken without approval. The precedent it might set if other commanders tried to imitate it without Fluckey's judgment. Others saw something different. They saw initiative in its purest form. A commander identifying an enemy assumption and exploiting it before the enemy could adapt. They saw economy of force. 8 men and 2 explosives had forced Japan to divert resources that might have otherwise gone to resisting an invasion. Quietly, the tone shifted. USS Barb's patrol was classified as one of the most successful submarine missions of the war. Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor. Not for a single act, but for a pattern of aggressive innovation that consistently delivered results. The ground raid remained an anomaly. It was never repeated. No doctrine was written around it. Officially, it became a footnote. Unofficially, it became something else. A reminder that the most effective operations don't always come from perfect plans, but from commanders willing to see the battlefield differently. The submarine force continued to sink ships. The air forces continued to bomb cities. The war moved inexorably toward its conclusion. But somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese officers were still asking the same question long after USS Barb vanished from their coast. If submarines could do that, what else had they underestimated? That question lingered until the war ended. And it was exactly the kind of question Eugene Fluckey had wanted them to ask. By every measurable standard, USS Barb's final patrol should have ended in disaster. Submarines were fragile machines. They relied on stealth, not speed. Surfacing near enemy territory erased their greatest advantage. Landing men on hostile shores multiplied the risk beyond anything naval planners were comfortable admitting. And yet it worked, not because the rules were wrong, but because they were incomplete. World War II doctrine was built around averages. Average enemy reaction time, average patrol coverage, average decision-making. What Fluckey exploited was the gap between doctrine and human behavior. Japanese defenses were designed to stop what had happened before. Aircraft raids, surface bombardments, submarines attacking shipping offshore. They were not designed to stop a submarine captain who combined all three ideas and then added something entirely new. The raid succeeded because it happened once. Repetition would have been fatal. The moment the enemy expected it, the advantage vanished. Fluckey understood that instinctively. Innovation in war is perishable. This is a pattern seen again and again in World War II's most effective operations. The first use of radar-guided interception, the first mass parachute drop, the first carrier strike. They worked not because they were perfect, but because the enemy had not yet learned how to counter them. USS Barb's mission did not create a new branch of warfare. It created uncertainty, and uncertainty forces mistakes. That is the real legacy of the patrol. Not the rockets, not the rail sabotage, not even the Medal of Honor. The legacy was proof that initiative could outrun planning, that a commander willing to accept personal responsibility could achieve results that committees could not design in advance. This lesson quietly survived the war. Modern special operations doctrine would eventually formalize many of these principles. Small teams, limited objectives, psychological impact over physical destruction. Fluckey didn't invent those ideas. He simply applied them at a time when almost no one else dared to. When the war ended, USS Barb returned home without fanfare. There were no parades for submarines, no victory marches for the men who had spent years submerged, fighting an enemy they rarely saw. Most of the crew simply went back to civilian life, carrying memories they would struggle to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Eugene Fluckey stayed in the Navy. He taught, he advised, and occasionally, when pressed, he spoke about the patrol off Japan. But he never framed it as heroism. To Fluckey, the mission was the natural outcome of a simple question. What is the enemy not expecting today? That question followed him long after World War II. It appeared in Cold War submarine doctrine, in special operations planning, in the quiet emphasis on adaptability over procedure. USS Barb herself would go on to serve in another war, then disappear into history, scrapped like most instruments of victory. Only a small plaque and a few lines in official histories marked what she had done. But the idea she carried did not disappear. Every time a commander deviates from the expected path, not recklessly, but deliberately, the shadow of that patrol reappears. The lesson is uncomfortable because it resists standardization. You can't write a manual for intuition. You can't guarantee the outcome of audacity. You can only decide whether the moment demands obedience or imagination. On a frozen night in 1945, off a coastline that was never meant to be reached, one submarine commander chose imagination. And for a brief moment, the rules of war bend around that choice. If you found this story worth telling, subscribe for more real World War II events where a single decision changed everything. Like the video, and comment below with the mission you think history overlooked. Because some of the most important battles are the ones that leave almost no trace, except in the way wars are fought afterward. World War II has a memory problem. It remembers the biggest battles, the bloodiest beaches, the loudest victories. It forgets the operations that were too strange, too small, or too uncomfortable to fit neatly into heroic narratives. USS Barb fell into that gap. There was no invasion to point to, no city reduced to rubble, no decisive turning point on a map. Instead, there was an action that embarrassed assumptions on both sides. For the Japanese, it exposed a weakness they never admitted publicly. The home islands were vulnerable in ways their defenses had never considered. For the U.S. Navy, it raised a more awkward issue. How many opportunities have been missed because no one was willing to deviate from doctrine? Wars reward results, but institutions reward consistency. USS Barb delivered the first and violated the second. That tension is why the patrol was praised quietly and never replicated. It was safer to admire Fluckey than to encourage others to imitate him. History books followed the same instinct. The ground raid didn't change the war's outcome. The rockets didn't cripple industry. The mission didn't scale, but it did something historians struggle to measure. It changed how commanders thought about possibility. That kind of influence leaves few documents. No casualty figures. No before and after charts. Only decisions made later, shaped by the knowledge that boundaries once believed fixed had already been crossed. USS Barb was not forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it succeeded in a way that didn't fit the story people expected World War II to tell. And that may be its most revealing legacy of all. There's a quiet moment in every war when a boundary stops being theoretical. Not a border on a map, not a line drawn by diplomats, but a mental boundary, the belief that something will not happen. For Japan, that boundary was the home islands. For years, the Imperial Navy assured its people that the sea was a shield. That submarines could harass shipping. Yes, but that no enemy would dare come close enough to touch the land itself. USS Barb crossed that line. And once crossed, it could never be uncrossed. After the patrol, Japanese coastal commanders tightened defenses not because of damage, but because of doubt. Every rail line near the coast became suspect. Every dark shape offshore became a threat. Resources were diverted, patrols reassigned, assumptions rewritten. This was the hidden cost of the raid. War is not only about destruction. It is about forcing the enemy to defend more than they can afford. Fluckey's operation imposed a tax on Japanese confidence that could never be refunded. The Americans understood this instinctively, even if they never formalized it. Intelligence summaries noted increased coastal activity. Submarine captains noticed thinner escort coverage elsewhere. One small action had shifted attention, and attention is finite. The irony is that this kind of success rarely repeats itself. Once a boundary is crossed, it becomes guarded. Surprise du quai. The window closes. USS Barb arrived at the exact moment when the idea was unthinkable and left before it became obvious. That is the razor's edge of innovation in war. Too early, and no one follows. Too late, and the enemy is ready. Fluckey arrived precisely on time, and then he never tried to repeat it. The crew of USS Barb returned to the Pacific bases largely unseen. They had achieved feats no one believed possible, yet their names rarely appeared in newspapers. History rarely celebrates those who succeed quietly. 8 men had walked the snow-dusted shore of Japan, placed explosives under a rail line, and returned without a single shot fired in anger. Each carried a story few would hear and fewer could imagine. For the machinists, gunners, and electricians, the patrol was as much a test of nerves as of skill. Every step on enemy soil was a gamble. One wrong movement, one snapped rope, one misfired detonator could have meant immediate execution. Yet they moved with precision, courage forged in months of training beneath the ocean, where error meant the same: death. They did not consider themselves heroes. They considered themselves a crew doing their duty. And in doing so, they redefined what duty could look like. Their actions were invisible in the grand scheme of the Pacific War. No headlines, no celebrations, no parades. But for those who understood, it was an act that reshaped naval thinking about risk, initiative, and psychological warfare. Fluckey's leadership left an impression far larger than his medal could capture. He trusted his men in ways most commanders never dared, and in return, they trusted him to navigate not only the submarine, but the terrifying unknowns of their mission. That trust, more than rockets or explosives, was what made the patrol possible. The men returned to daily life aboard submarines, in ports across the Pacific, and eventually in civilian life. but each carried a memory that could not be erased. The sound of the train exploding in the stillness, the faint glow of factories lighting the snow, the exhilaration of surviving an operation so improbable it felt impossible. USS Barb's patrol was a whisper in history, but for the men who lived it, it was a lifetime of echoes. It is in these shadows, in the unseen acts, that war sometimes writes its most profound stories, not in massive victories, but in quiet defiance, in the courage to act where no one else will. USS Barb's patrol offers a lesson that survives decades of peace, even when the submarine itself is long gone. It is a lesson about risk, initiative, and the unseen ripples of action. One commander, 8 men, a handful of rockets, and a small explosive charge on a single rail line. That was all it took to shift the calculations of a nation, if only for a moment. The psychological impact of the mission outlasted its physical results. Japan diverted troops, reassigned patrols, and strengthened coastal defenses, all in reaction to a force that vanished into the night. In military terms, this is sometimes called economy of force, achieving maximum effect with minimal expenditure. But more than that, it was proof that audacity, executed with preparation and calm judgment, can outperform overwhelming power. Fluckey's example influenced generations of naval officers. Special operations units, unconventional raids, and the principles of surprise and initiative all carry echoes of that frozen night in January 1945. Barb proved that war is not just fought on maps or measured in tonnage sunk. It is fought in the choices commanders make when the rulebook no longer suffices. For history, USS Barb remains a paradox, almost forgotten because it was so effective yet enduring in its influence. It teaches that the boldest victories are sometimes invisible, and the most important lessons are learned not from overwhelming force, but from daring to defy expectation. In the end, the submarine returned to its watery world, the men returned to their lives, and the war moved toward its conclusion. Yet, the story of a captain willing to challenge the impossible reminds us that the boundary between fear and courage is often crossed by choice, not chance. And that is the enduring truth of USS Barb. A single patrol, a single night, a small group of men, leaving a mark far greater than the eyes of history could easily see.